All right, let's get it on.
Hello and welcome to another video on the Anbernic RG503. This time we're testing Dreamcast. We've already had a bit of a first look at this device and we've also done a PSP analysis video, so make sure you go and check those two videos out on my channel. So today we're going to be testing 11 games on Dreamcast. Now my expectations were that Dreamcast was a little bit more demanding than PSP, and we've already seen how PSP plays out on the RG503. It runs pretty well. There are some 60 FPS games that don't work well, and also some of the more demanding 30 FPS games don't work that well. But on the whole, I was pleased with the performance of the RG503 in PSP. There are just a ton of role-playing games that you can play at 30 FPS at full speed, and so I think it's still a pretty decent PSP emulation handheld. Now coming back to Dreamcast, I do think Dreamcast is a little bit more demanding than PSP, so I wasn't sure what to expect here. I've tested the RG351P and also the RG552, and so you can go and check out the RG552 video on Dreamcast. There isn't a video on RG351, but I played plenty of it to tell you that there aren't that many games on Dreamcast that run on the RG351. And on the RG552, Dreamcast runs fairly well, but there are still a few titles that don't work great. Things like Dead or Alive 2, for example, are still a little bit slow on the RG552. Let's talk about Crazy Taxi, and here we have it running pretty much full speed. I was pretty happy with the performance here, and there is some audio crackling that you probably won't be able to hear because of my voiceover. But overall, I think Crazy Taxi is really playable here. So there are also other Crazy Taxi titles as well. There's Crazy Taxi Fair Wars on PSP, which is kind of the double pack of Crazy Taxi games. You get Crazy Taxi 1 and 2. Now, I tested that on the RG552, which is a little bit stronger device, and that didn't work that well on the RG552. So I don't expect that to work here on the RG503. However, Crazy Taxi 2 on Dreamcast, I expect that to run this pretty comfortably, so it'll be more or less the same sort of performance that you're seeing here. Okay, so the next game is Formula 1 World Grand Prix, and I've picked a very special track. This is the track for my hometown, Melbourne, and I used to work next to Albert Park. So I know this track very well, and we'll talk more about that later, but first let's talk about the game. And I'm really happy to get a Formula 1 game on a handheld that runs really well. And I've always said that PlayStation 2 level of graphics was really where it was at for me, because that was where we moved past a lot of like the PlayStation 1 sort of low-res textures and low-res 3D polygon builds. So PlayStation 2 was really where it was at, and Dreamcast is kind of at that PlayStation 2 level. So I think this is a really great looking game that runs really well here. And if you think about it, the PlayStation 2 era, or the Dreamcast era, was really where it was at in terms of proper 3D racing games, because we had the 8-bit era and the 16-bit era where they were still making sort of 3D, pseudo 3D style of racing games, but they were really 2D games. We had all that Mode 7 stuff on the SNES. And then after that we had PlayStation games, but as I said, PlayStation 1 style games were very sort of rudimentary style of graphics and very low res. I went back and played some of those, and they still play fine. They're pretty enjoyable, especially on something like an RG351. But I think with the Dreamcast and PlayStation 2, it was really that sort of next-gen type of performance. So as I said, I actually used to work around Albert Park, and I worked right across the road from Albert Park, and Albert Park is such a beautiful place, and I've watched all of the Grand Prix, and I think it's a very special racetrack. There's a lake in the middle of it, and I used to go running around the lake. It's around 5 kilometers right around the lake, so I would go for a run after work all the time before I'd go back home. And sometimes I'd do 5Ks, sometimes I'd do 10Ks, but you could go running all year round. It wasn't ever that cold in winter. It got very hot in summer, but if you're doing it after work, like 5 p.m., 6 p.m., then it's not that hot anymore. It might be like 25 degrees after work. So it was a great run, and it was great to have this park pretty much right next to the CBD, which is the Central Business District. So I worked at an engineering firm for about 5 years across from Albert Park, and we were on the 6th level, and I would actually just make sure that I had lots of work for that week, the Grand Prix weekend, so that I would be able to go back into the office and do my work on the weekend and watch the Grand Prix as well, especially on the Saturday and the Sunday. And the Saturday, of course, is the qualifying, which is just like an hour or so. But on the Sunday, you'd go and you could enjoy the 2-hour race. You'd only see like part of the track, of course, but you could hear it. You really could hear the Grand Prix for about 10 kilometers away from the track. So being right next to the track, it was just incredibly loud. You didn't even want to open the windows because it was so loud. But it was really enjoyable to just watch it out of the window on one side of the building. People were paying $100, maybe $200 for a ticket to the racetrack, and we were seeing it for free 6 floors up, and we could pretty much see at least 300-400 meters of the racetrack, and it was super awesome. Okay, let's talk about Gigawing. Now, I've tested Gigawing a few times, but on different emulators. So on the RG552, I tested Gigawing on Dreamcast, and then on Miu Mini, I tested it on the CPS2 emulator, which is the Capcom arcade emulator. Now, the Miu Mini is a lot more underpowered than the Rockchip 3566 in the RG503. So I figured, well, let's try the Dreamcast emulator first, and then if that doesn't work, we'll go to the CPS2 emulator. But luckily enough, this runs great on the Dreamcast emulator, which, by the way, is on the flycast core on retroarch. So I wasn't sure what to expect because I don't really test flycast that much. I'm mostly on the Redream emulator on Android, so I've got more experience with that. But a lot of these titles actually run really great on flycast on retroarch. So the next game is Jet Set Radio, or Jet Grind Radio, depending on which region you're from. Now I get a lot of requests to test this out, and usually the requests are more like demands, like, you're testing Dreamcast, but you're not testing Jet Set Radio, fail. So here we go, I'm testing Jet Set Radio now. One of the reasons why I don't test some games is because I've never played them before. So as you're going to see, usually you're going to have to go through the tutorial, you're going to have to learn how to play, you're going to look really bad as you're playing it, like I'm doing here. So the quality of the gameplay isn't going to be as good, so I'm okay with that if it's just a couple of games here and there. But usually I'd rather actually know how to play a game so that the testing process is a little bit easier and doesn't take as long. But here, all I'm really after is just testing out the performance for you guys so you can see what the performance is like. And overall, I think Jet Set Radio runs fine on the RG503. So here's another game that I haven't played before. This is Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Now usually I test Marvel Superheroes, which is a completely different game. I thought that's what I put on the system, but actually yeah, it's Marvel vs. Capcom 2. And I haven't set up my buttons. My shoulder triggers aren't actually working here, so I'm really just using the 4 face buttons here. So the Y button, it appears, is the punch button, but X, A, and B seem like it's kick buttons, so that was really weird when I was playing this. But overall, I think you can see that the performance is pretty good for Marvel vs. Capcom 2. So this is Metropolis Street Racer, and I've tested this a few times before. I've tested it on the PowerKitty X18S. I believe I tested it on the RG552 as well. Now this is a game that runs at 30 FPS normally, so I expected this to work, even though I thought it would be kind of demanding. But overall, as you can see, it runs pretty smoothly here at full speed. So one of the things about this game is that it's super dark. Like, you can see that this is supposed to be at midday, and it runs on a real-time clock. But you can see here that midday kind of looks like it's this is midday in San Francisco as well. Midday looks like it's I don't know, like 9 p.m. at nighttime. So it's a little bit off, but that's okay. This game was really supposed to be played at nighttime or during the night settings, I find. So the night races look pretty good, although I do feel like it's really dark there. But overall, Metropolis Street Racer is that kind of very dark looking racing game. So you may have noticed that it's actually using a very low first person view here, and you can set it to a third person view, which is behind the car. However, every time I set that, it would actually just revert back to this first person view camera, which I thought was really weird. That didn't happen on the other systems I tested it on, like the X18S or the RG552. So I'm not really sure what's going on here. Maybe it's just the emulator in RetroArch. So this is Ready to Rumble Boxing, and this is another game that I haven't played before, but I figured I would probably be able to stumble through. But it was pretty tricky to play this. I only managed to just beat the first guy, and most of the time it was because I would just be punching thin air. And I figured that I can just throw a haymaker and try to like move out of the way when he punches. And that was basically my strategy, which I don't think is going to work later on in the game. So one of the reasons why I tested this was that I was really looking for games that were sort of not as demanding as the games that I know probably wouldn't work, like Dead or Alive 2. And this game plays fine, so you're probably going to find quite a few games out there that aren't so demanding on the Dreamcast that are going to work fine on the RG503. So here is a game that I've tested quite a lot of and I know will work on the RG503, and that is Soul Calibur. This is a game that I've tested on the RG351P, which is a much weaker system, and it works on that. Although in that system, it actually runs at 320 by 240p resolution. So the resolution is a lot lower, but nevertheless, it still runs really well on that CPU and pretty much runs at full speed. There is a slight touch of slowdown, but it's very playable on that RG351P. On the RG503, it just runs perfectly. This is running at 1x resolution, so 640 by 480, and it runs very smoothly. In fact, I would go so far as to say that this is one of the best performing games on the RG503. It's basically flawless. So I think Soul Calibur fans, I think that you could definitely take a look at the RG503. If you play a ton of Soul Calibur, well, Soul Calibur 1 on Dreamcast works great on this system, but not only that, Soul Calibur Broken Destiny runs really well on the PSP as well. This is Virtua Tennis 2 or Tennis 2K2, and unfortunately this is the first game that doesn't work as well that I tested. Now I'm pretty surprised because I thought maybe about half of these games wouldn't work well on the RG503, but Virtua Tennis 2 is really the only game that I tested that didn't work as well. And this is probably running at about 30 FPS, even though this game is supposed to be running at 60 FPS normally. And so I think you can see from the gameplay here that it's definitely running slow. So I don't think this is a very good experience. Now the good news is that for Virtua Tennis fans, you can just play Virtua Tennis World Tour on the PSP, and that runs perfectly fine at 60 FPS. So go back and check my PSP analysis video and check Virtua Tennis and see how that runs there. This is another highly requested game. This is Tokyo Xtreme Racer. Now previously I actually said that this game was really hard and I didn't know how to play this game because I just kept losing all the time. I'm not sure what happened last time, but I managed to win a couple of races here, so perhaps it's just not as hard as I thought it was, or maybe I was just pressing the wrong buttons or doing something wrong last time. Or maybe, I think like once you fall behind the rival, sometimes it can be a bit hard to catch up. So here, I was always ahead of the rival and he didn't seem like he was, it seemed like it was a bit hard for him to catch up. So I managed to win pretty comfortably both times. The other thing about this game is that I think this game looks really good. Like for a game that is supposed to be really dark, a nighttime racer, if you compare this to Metropolis Street Racer, Metropolis Street Racer is just a very dark looking game. That still looks good, but I think the art style here makes this look much better than MSR. Okay, finally we have Virtua Fighter 3TB. This is another game that also runs really well on the RG351P, so I pretty much knew that this was going to work, and as you can see, this works perfectly fine here, no issues at all. Runs at 60 FPS even though the counter is not on. And I think that's really great news because I do think that Virtua Fighter 3 is a huge step up from Virtua Fighter 2 on the Saturn or the Mega Drive. Okay, so I'm just going to let this video play out. I hope you enjoyed that look at the Anbernic RG503. Overall, I was fairly impressed with the performance of this device. I think $140 is a little bit expensive, although if you can find it for say like $120 or even a little bit lower than that, I think this would be a pretty interesting system to consider at those prices. So in terms of PSP, it can probably play about half of the library, particularly 30 FPS or role-playing games. And then on Dreamcast, I only really tested games that were sort of mid-level in terms of how performance demanding it is. So for those mid-level type of games, it seems like it plays fairly well. I didn't test the most demanding games on Dreamcast, like Dead or Alive 2, for example. But overall, I think you can see the level of Dreamcast performance here plays quite a number of games. Okay, so that's going to do it for this one. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one.